Thank you, Jean-Paul. Bonjour. It's always a problem of language when we go abroad. Fortunately for you, I'm really completely inexperienced in speaking Arabic, so I cannot say anything. So this is good for you. I'm French and Austrian, so for French I'm not French. For Austrians I'm not Austrian. So I moved to Europe because also I grew up in Austria and I didn't live there for the last 15 years. Anyhow, so what Jean-Paul didn't say, and I think two elements might be interesting about myself, hopefully, is that until last July, for 2 years, I worked for the European Commission again as the resident energy advisor to the Cypriot authorities on restructuring the energy reform. So how to say, I was, let's say, the catalyzer between the Troika, so IMF and ECFIN, so basically the fiscal guys from the Commission and the central bank, and the authorities, meaning the government, the ministry, and the regulatory authorities in Cyprus, for bringing, let's say, reform to the Cypriot energy market. And as the climate is quite similar, and I think also some other elements I've heard today in Lebanon are quite similar to the situation in Cyprus. This might be interesting. And the second thing is, I mean, I worked, and still, I mean, since July, I have some shares in operational companies supplying energy to industrial customers in Europe, and some other things. So I'm working a bit, let's say, on energy policy and consulting in these things to governments or administration and the Commission. And at the same time, I'm quite proud to try to be a small entrepreneur and really live the things people are talking about practically. And I invested also in photovoltaics and renewable energy since 2009 when I set up my company. And hence, to me, the whole thing is about bringing together, let's say, the old regime of hydrocarbons or coal and whatsoever, and maybe new options, which brings, let's say, the solution to the final customer and a concrete result. So. First, one general explanation. What does the European Academy of Region mean? Of course, it's a European context, and as you have heard, I have two nationalities. So to me, in the end, if you are free to move and free to work nearly everywhere you want, the nationality to me has not too much of importance. But in a globalized world, I think the local aspect and the regional aspect of individual lives is very important, and actually it becomes more and more important. Even in France, which is a very centralized country, you talk about regions or the left behinds, as they call it sometimes also. So you have not even a clear definition what is a regional approach. Of course, for energy terms, very often it's considered supranational, meaning that you have a global market more and more for LNG, we have heard this morning. We have some international cooperation. We have, of course, gas pipelines, for example, crossing half of Europe, or basically connecting all countries of Europe together with some major production countries. And then you have also the subnational approach, meaning really the local community or a region which is part of a country or part of several countries, but geographically linked together somehow. So basically, to me, the definition is more, the region is something which is closer to the individual than let's say, a state. Bringing me to the topic, energy policy. I mean, we are living in kind of changing times. Most likely, everybody living before has also lived in changing times, but for the time being, we have the first time the experience that we are really in a period of climate change, which is a global phenomenon. I know that some presidents of large countries don't see that, but anyway, let's say for the time being, there's some evidence that things might change. And we are living over the last 15 years, let's say, a boost of economic globalization, meaning integration of cash flows and also product which are produced not where they are consumed anymore, but maybe have been delocalized somewhere and still consumed in other areas. And what's something which is also kind of important to me is the asymmetric population growth, as I called it. So basically, 100 years ago or even 70 years ago, the centers, let's say, of global population are not the centers of global population now or even in the next 20 years, according to forecasts. Hence, also the pattern of energy needs is changing from some areas which are less important to emerging markets, as they call it. And hence, considering now more Europe and Lebanon and this hemisphere, it's more and more difficult for, let's say, let's call it the old heavy investment cycle industry to deliver, as the changes in setting, I mean in policy, in stability, in market is so fast that it's very difficult to take an investment decision. I've worked in a classic gas business company, and we did an investment of 130 million for 30 years. But of course, which is nothing on energy terms, but still for me it would be too much. The problem is if you invest for now. I mean, we have heard from Kuwait, no, from Qatar. Sorry, the previous speaker, that they had invested in the US for $1.2 billion for something which they didn't use anymore. I mean, this is of course of significant interest to a normal private investor. So. You can do it on a state level or in some special cases, but normally you want a return on investment which is kind of foreseeable and tangible, and not something where you say, okay, in 20, 30 years, I want to be there and I don't care about the return on investment. So the old type of cycle worked well. However, unfortunately, it didn't deliver, or it failed to avoid climate change. And unfortunately, this is something which is a basic element on policy, at least in Europe. We will see it in the next slide. So if you take it seriously, that this should be avoided, I mean climate change, then of course this has effects on economy and especially energy policy. Or if you say nothing happens, then of course you could continue the business as usual. But there, it's really very much to policy decision makers to decide on what is the view of the future, which is of course quite difficult. However, in the recent decade, or even a little bit more than the recent decade, independently of let's say. The classic energy business, we had, let's say, new technologies in communication and data transfer. I mean, internet, everybody knows it. The concept of internet is the opposite of a centralized system. It's not the French, what was it called, Minitel, which was a central server, basically, and then, but it's the opposite. You have many small servers simulating to be one global net, but if there's a server default somewhere, 99% of users are not aware of it. And basically these new technologies on communication and so on opened also new ways of managing networks, I mean electricity networks and other networks. And in addition, we have seen technological developments in of course in renewable energy production, but also in aspects of demand response and energy efficiency and so on. So these kind of, I call it new types of investments, are of much lower magnitude than classical, let's say, hydrocarbon investments, and the return on investment normally is much faster if there is some. But at least one thing is sure: it can attract completely different investors than, let's say, the classical hydrocarbon business, or even more extreme. The nuclear energy business, which are on global scale, you have, I don't know, 5, something like this. And a second aspect of these new possibilities of small-scale energy generation or avoidance of the need of energy, meaning energy efficiency and demand response, is of course that you have the citizen or the ultimate customer much closer to the way energy is produced. So that gives you, on one hand, more different investors, as said, and the second aspect also a bigger acceptance normally of customers who are affected by, I mean, by some visual impacts of eolic wind parks or of wind parks or something like that, but they understand what it's for. You also have another side effect, which is very well seen now in the European Union market. The smaller, I mean, if you're autonomous as on a small scale, I mean, small industry or communes or even persons, then you have more power and you're independent of the larger ones. So you don't need a Reva or somebody to provide you with electricity or a power plant. Hence, you don't care if it exists or not. And this has quite some significant impact, let's say, on the acceptance of the other companies in the investment chain. On the other hand, of course, with new technologies, with new or with changing paradigm in energy policy, you don't know where you're going, so the previsibility is very low. And if you want to bring the energy there where it's needed, of course you need infrastructure, but it's less and less clear what kind of infrastructure you need and where, and also what kind of security you have that your investment will pay off. And in the European Union, not only for energy policy, as you most likely know, but in the European Union, the energy policy led to sort of a messy situation. And 2 months ago, the European Commission proposed a very, very ambitious and large package, which is called the Clean Energy for All package, which for the first time adopted a sort of what they call a holistic approach of some elements of energy policy which tended to exclude themselves, meaning security of supply, competitive markets, integration of renewables, energy efficiency, and also, and this has been done on a high political level, the European Union and its member states have adopted a roadmap for 2050, claiming that they want to decarbonize the economy by 90%, meaning 90% less emissions than currently. Meaning that 30 years is much for a lifetime, but it's basically nothing for natural gas infrastructure. Meaning whatever investment decision you take, if this is to be taken seriously, and if you don't believe in carbon capture, capturing and storing, then there's no natural gas market in Europe in 30 years. And this has been also, let's say, adopted in the COP21 Paris Agreement on a larger scale. Of course, the European Union is not one country or a bloc, but a multitude of member states. And if you go into details, and if you're in Brussels, it's kind of either interesting or a little bit disappointing to see what the interests really are. And hence, the least you can say is that progress towards this is slow, and it has to be seen whether you can take this seriously or not. Now, if you want to invest in Europe in kind of infrastructure, it's very difficult to assess whether there will be something in 20 years which will pay you back your investment or not. And hence, the European Union has seen a decrease in investments in power plants, even in divestment. We also have this economic crisis and so on in Europe, so the gas market for the time being is decreasing. Okay. Also, you have, let's say, different types of customers. You have globalized industry, which needs competitive prices on a global scale. We've heard fertilizers are more and more, let's say, produced where you have gas, in Qatar, for example. But the local people want to have, let's say, a service without interruption of electricity and so on at a fair price. And hence, to be really, let's say, a little bit broad, also today, I've heard plenty of people talking about strategy, but nobody's defined a vision. I mean, normally, before you should talk about a strategy, you should know where you want to go. This needs to be something which is very long-term and very short and very clear. And, and once you have it, you should not change it all the time. Which is also a very difficult process, at least in the European Union. And the third thing is, normally, if somebody proclaims a vision and it's not shared by, let's say, the people who are in the market, who are consuming that energy, then it's also very difficult to make it happen. And then you have several sub-parts. I mean, you have technical problems, you have financial problems, you have societal problems of society, meaning what kind of actors you want in the market or not, so big companies or also smaller companies, and private money or only state money, which brings me to the conclusion. What I've seen also in Cyprus, the biggest thing about an energy strategy or a comprehensive energy strategy is that it's a process, meaning you have to integrate and take on board most stakeholders you can, and you have normally different steps of consultation processes and so on. Normally in European Union it's done with green books and then white books and then legislation which follows this process. And that energy includes not only electricity but also transport and heating and cooling. And for example, I think in Lebanon, it's very clear that you I mean, if you go for hydrocarbons, even if you find them, the effect will take place earliest in 10 to 15 years. However, in the meantime, you could do plenty of things. In the building sector, you could insulate the buildings. You reduce massively the need for electricity. I mean, in Cyprus, really, we have spent millions in several studies and so on, and I coordinated a whole lot of them. And if you go more into details, you can avoid so much energy you want to produce by very cheap effects. And to me, so to be a little bit polemic here, the indigenous hydrocarbon question is not the answer to all of the problems. Of course, it's nice to have, but only if it's managed well. And we have heard about the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and it should not be too politicized. And you should do it dually, meaning you have this kind of policy which leads to 10 to 15 years, which has 10 to 15 years lead time. But at the same time, you could raise plenty of potential in the short term, meaning with flexibility, with energy efficiency, with integration of renewables, and this is secure, fast, and rather cheap. And because we're in ESA, to conclude, I mean, much of the problem of this energy transition is coming from the financing model. I mean, how you provide the financing to these investments. Is it net present value only, or is it a lifetime calculation? There are many new models which are emerging in the European Union market, and also the other thing is this let's say smart grid and energy efficiency and renewable energy market and generation. It can be driven by many small companies which do not need too much capital, and so many startups we have seen in European Union and also in China and some other places are really doing very well with not much capital, and they create local wealth and local knowledge which can then be exported elsewhere. Thanks a lot.